to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
The Lacy Brooks Pack, Neon Moon, Part 1. When the sun goes down on my side of town, that lonesome feeling comes to my door, and the whole world turns blue. I spend most every night beneath the light of a neon moon. Brooks and Dunn. So this is Chez Lefevre, Val announced as she and Earl bustled into her home. It had an empty feeling to it. It was still new to her, and her furniture and other items did little to fill the space. It smelled a little musty as well. She'd been away from it longer than she'd planned. You may have some spoiled milk in the icebox, Earl informed her. His nose was in the air and working. No one else has been here, though. There's still plenty of lupine in him, she decided. Likely a few food items have turned. It's the smallest house on the block and still too big for me. In some ways, I miss my apartment, especially with having to take care of the yard and so much else. I never understood that a house required constant upkeep. When we were kids, my brother and I helped our folks, but it's not the same as having to take care of everything. She glanced over her shoulder at the large man, who could tear apart most professional athletes at need, yet now appeared lost and a little vulnerable, she decided. Come on, I'll show you your room and you can get settled in. It must be strange after living out in the woods for so long. He grunted wordlessly in response. Yep, still a wolf, though old Earl would have likely made the same kind of response, just not so growly. She grinned. Here you go. Why don't you keep the towels we got for our cleanup? I don't have any guest stuff. She stopped speaking as she felt herself lifted and pressed close to the iron muscles and bones of the big man. She joined in the fierce embrace enthusiastically. The same move had been on her mind. It had simply been a matter of time and privacy. They had a great deal of stress, anxiety, and long repressed attraction to resolve, and it took the rest of the night to work through it all, or at least get a start on the process. They got off to a great beginning. Lacy stalked her prey in utter silence. Her children flanked her. Out front just a short distance, they were downwind, and their selected dinner for the evening had escaped a pen and wandered far from its fellows. Those fellows finally caught the scent of the apex predators and bleated warnings. He looked up, startled, and searched for the sounds. He never found them. The goat's last gesture, raising his head, set him up for the killing stroke by Oscar? No, Earl too. So like his father, Lacy thought forlornly. Her son carried the now dripping prize as they melted into the thick brush near White Sands Lake. They had to get away from the settled areas, even the ones that were no more than rural properties, set near the least prepossessing portions of the shore, where the land dropped too abruptly to risk more expensive foundations, or was merely swampy and prone to minor flooding. It was a land of people with few means, yet it too was populated for a group of large predators to go undetected for long. Lacy wasn't hungry. She would eat, but her heart was a desert, something she'd seen on a nature program while perched on the couch at Earl's old house. She'd been trying to heal then, too, and had Val beside her. It seemed so long ago. Now, were it not for Earl, too, and Adele, she thought she might simply curl up into a ball of misery until she died. Her children were physically grown, mostly, yet she knew that they still needed guidance. She and Oscar had raised a pair of beings that could go forth proudly in any setting, yet there was no substitute for experience. They had so much to look forward to. She had been wool gathering and almost missed that her pups had stopped and disappeared into the landscape. She did the same, leaving her nose up to the breeze. Her Squatch friends had come to visit and had brought the little skunk ape they'd met on their way to the facility. She realized that they were likely all of the cryptids left in the area. The old couple of the forest and the skunk ape were natural creatures, and she and her pups were adapted beings. Still, they were different than other creatures and beings. They were typically unassociated rarities, now allied by necessity. She called out to the big male squatch that Val referred to as Sir Slam-A-Lot, and he responded with her agreed-upon response. They soon met in a small clearing around a log that had been a fallen forest giant. "We found this one, and he said that he knew you," the tallest being gestured, with a few rumbles and grunts for emphasis. The skunk ape opened his palm. "You said truth. I could not leave. Now the bad 2 legs are gone. Big boat." Lacy understood the submissive gesture and the gist of what the creature tried to communicate. She had decided what it had meant on the big boat. The gesture it made was for big floating log. "Now you speak truth. Do you wish to join us? Have the old folk of the forest told you about our plan?" The creature hooted. "Yes, my lost people are on the big floating log. Dead or alive, I want them." Lacy understood the sentiment. She wanted to rescue the other cryptids, natural or adapted. She also wanted revenge on the wicked 2 legs. They needed to die and to suffer first if she could manage it. The keeper bustled about and snapped at the Z-text to keep them focused. It seemed that since Narcissa was no longer there to perform the dance and chant routine in person, that their already limited focus had become moot. They'd grown surly and recalcitrant. Still, they held things together so that he could oversee the major tasks of the move. It was a critical process, yet simple in execution. A transfer of bodies from the port to the warehouse district, a little closer to downtown. The main concern was that the bodies were those of dangerous predators, both natural and transformed. He'd dosed all the cryptids of either type with zombie venom, but had not bothered with the hypnotic portion of the process. They needed only to be in a sedated state to keep them pliant until they were once again in a secure environment. He inspected each of his charges and noted that they shared the slack-jaw stares associated with the venom. Some still appeared to glower at him truculently, despite their dull expressions and glazed eyes. All those who hadn't been subjected to the song and dance Narcissa did positively radiated hostile intentions. Baby Narcissa's silly rituals were necessary to the process and not merely a method to insist on greater pay. It didn't matter to the keeper. The transport cages were strong enough, and soon he'd have the things locked away once more in a much better location. Some of the crew from the ship would replace the living souls who had always been essential to the operations. He'd have 4 of those and his remaining Z-techs. One of the latter, unworthies, slammed into him from behind and then careened on down the passageway he had been traversing. "Watch it," he screeched and then mumbled. Hard to imagine that was once a PhD. The Z-tech lurched to a stop. It stood, staring as usual, a small rope of drool dangling from one corner of its mouth. Then it turned to face him with glacial gradualness. It assumed an expression on its previously slack features. A scowl. I, It coughed forth, then cleared its throat like a lecturer in preparation for a speech. I, still a physician, Claude. The keeper was completely taken aback. The zombie had always had the ability to speak, and did so when required. Yet this was mostly original thought, expressed from someone he'd been assured was in a cognitive comatose state. The zombie stood and stared, unsure what to do next. "Go on about your assigned task as instructed," the keeper ordered, after a tense moment in which the being simply stared, hard-eyed at him. It eventually turned and resumed the shuffling gait down the passageway. The keeper shook his head. "As soon as we get settled in a new place, that one is getting fed to something, maybe several somethings. I will hear no excuses. You lost containment previously. Do it again, and I will give you an arena-eye view of being fed to a monster." Dr. Z glared into the little screen on the keeper's device. "No problem, Doc, I promise. While they've all acted a little squirrely, they are docile enough to move. There'll be the added security of the truck to hold their cages in place and to reinforce the walls. We've already put away the Janoska and 2 Gugwe, the dogmen, and the remaining werewolf. Oh, and the big black cat. Those were the most dangerous of the lot. And the rest will be pretty easy. Just 2 more trips. See to it that they are well guarded on both ends and in the middle for the ride. It will be shortly to supervise the warehouse and set up the lab. Now get back to work and focus on what you are doing." The doctor terminated the call and put down his device. He hated driving and detested the idea that others might share his roadway. He was worried about the keeper's overall untrustworthiness, yet he was genuinely confident in the man's capabilities. Things were moving swiftly, and in an unplanned fashion. He had all but decided that he would begin the great plan of his own volition. He was no longer sure that the operators were who or what they claimed. Several of the originals have been replaced. He could tell from their voices and demeanor. Perhaps the old goals have shifted to something else. Likely to greed, he seethed. His fury rose the closer he got to the choking highway arteries inside the city. His massive hands clenched strongly on the steering wheel until the metal beneath the padding groaned. When Valerie reluctantly left home to head to work, Earl assured her that he would clean the house and do his best to set his connections to work so they wouldn't have to worry about money. We, he'd said, she thought in wonder, we didn't discuss our status. It just sprouted, and we accepted it as natural. It feels natural. Maybe. Weird, but after taking on the monsters I've discovered over the past couple of years, she was caught in a mood that was somewhere between contentment, bedazzlement, and fear, mingled with the world around her that was far stranger than she'd ever imagined. She knew that she and the big bad wolf belonged together, though she couldn't help but snicker at the picture of herself as Little Red Riding Hood, packing a pistol. Might have some fun with that later. Enough. Time to focus on work. She would be glad for the distraction of returning to work and wondering which world would seem more real at the end of the day. Work kept her busy, and Earl remained equally so in his endeavor to once again piece together the life of a two-leg. He didn't have much to offer, but an anecdotal account of his own experiences. He was sure that he could prove that he'd been affected merely based on his current appearance as compared to how he looked the last time anyone had observed him. He would never have offered Lacy or his grandchildren as proof. and after experiencing captivity and experimentation, he wouldn't offer the personages of his fellow cryptids. They were intelligent creatures and beings to varying degrees, and aware of who they were. He had an empathy for being trapped and forced to remain at a distance from humanity. Fortunately, his friends were good and competent. He had a time and a place to meet and pick up his shiny new bona fides as Earl B. Wolf. He had also assurances that until he was fully established, funds would appear in Val's account to replace what she lost in her adventures and what would cost to get him back on 2 feet. When he picked up his credentials, he'd have to provide a briefing as well as receive one, and to submit a full medical examination. He wanted that anyway. He had to ensure that he was back for good, and that he posed no danger to others. The outlet would likely want to seek out the mad doctor and his menagerie of monsters. Cryptids, he corrected himself. He completed his tasks and prepared dinner for Val so that she could relax after her first day back on the job. When she burst in that evening, there was no time to relax. After a fierce embrace and kissing and greeting, she bounced loose and started placing her homework around the room and shedding uncomfortable shoes and other accoutrements. "Have you looked at the news? I only heard it on the radio. I think we may have some clues about the whereabouts of Dr. Strangeglove, or maybe Shizago? Whatever. The Freakenstein who captured us." Lacy, her turn on watch, considered for the first time that possessing above-average intelligence had repercussions and incited regrets. She relished her abilities and nature and the life that their transformation had given to Oscar and her. Yet there was some part of her that yearned for the carefree puppy she'd been before the critical bite by Lacy Elbert Wellwolf. She gazed over at the resting forms of her twins. They'd grown into fine young beings, and they would carry the memory of their father by the way they conducted their lives. Her heart swelled with pride for a moment, and she felt the first hint of the ice that had encompassed it to begin to melt. She thought of Earl and how he'd returned to something more than regular 2 legs, yet less in physical stature than what he'd been. He was somewhere in between worlds. He could not run full-time with the pack. Indeed, considering the sense that he and Val had given off, it was unlikely he would want such a life. She'd lost both of the strong male influences in the pack. Earl, too, was a fine young dog man, but he would always be her pup, her little fuzzball of a boy. She glanced at the setting sun and stared. It was time to wake the others and get going. They shouldn't be late for their first rendezvous with Earl and Val on the long hunt. They set up their typical scouting formations and used the intervening time to teach the new members of her oddly diverse pack how they did business, and how she and her children learned a new technique from the Squatches. The skunk ape had taken on the role of permanent overwatch. He was a solitary being and found working with the team to be difficult. Lacy and the rest had come to like him and feel protective of the puny fellow, who was, after all, no larger than the average professional offensive lineman. As he approached the warehouse, the keeper knew something had gone terribly wrong in his absence. He was at the head of a small convoy that transported the last and most easily handled of his charges, a pair of recently created dogmen and a skunk ape. The truck bay doors had been left standing open, despite his orders that they were to remain sealed until he contacted the warehouse team to open them for the final convoy. He knew that the living, sane people he'd left in charge of the Z-Techs were obedient to his orders. A yellow flashing light appeared inside the bay, its glare apparent as he drew near the opening and slowed to a stop. The rolling door was not only open, but clearly damaged and rent, drooping heavy on one side. He could see slow, coagulating, crimson puddles, splashes, and stains on the floor, and eventually made out that there were body parts strewn everywhere. The place was an abattoir. He rolled the truck into the bay, and the other truck followed, along with the drag vehicle. They had foregone a lead vehicle on the run. The living humans were assigned to take back the vehicles once the transport was complete. They had to use several crew members from the monster ferry to transport the cryptids from the big boat. He looked around carefully before he exited the big panel truck. One of the interior doors stood open. Other than a few dents and blood smears, it looked to be intact, simply open. He pulled his heavy rifle from the boot under the seat of the truck and looked back to ensure that the other truck operator and the 2 security team members in the trail vehicle had exited and armed themselves. Carlos Phosphorus wasn't normally brave or bold, but he knew that the others would be less so, that they had to contain the mess. They were not paid as well as he was, so by default, he was considered the senior employee and led the way inside. Once the team was inside the inner doorway, he beckoned to the last in line to close the door. It snicked shut and sealed them inside with the locks engaged. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The control room door was closed and secure. There was a window, but the glass on it was one way and reflected his image. He could not see inside. He pressed the intercom button. "If there's anyone inside, answer." He phrased the order so that if a Z-Tech was the only one in the room, it would respond. No one answered, but the door clicked loudly with the heavy lock disengaged. The keeper pulled it open and peered inside warily. There were 3 people in the room. One was heavily bandaged figure, seated in a chair, one of the live humans. The other 2 were Z-Techs. The last 2, as it happened. "Time to get up, Glambo. Our pack is just over the bridge." Earl gently squeezed Val's leg to awaken her from her nap, so needed at the end of the first week back to work. She blinked awake and looked over towards the big man and raised an eyebrow. "Glambo?" He grinned and winked. "Yeah, you know, all tactical and ready to kick arse and take names, but super hot in the process." At her continued silence, he turned down the intensity of his expression and said simply, "It's a combination. You usually don't wear makeup and jewelry when you go to the range. Just those baggy breeches and a loose shirt. You changed clothes in such a hurry when you got home from work, you forgot to take off your work face. It's a fetching combination." "I'm glad you like it." As she consciously, genuinely returned, she found that she enjoyed the typical, easy banter they'd developed from the first time they'd met. "Camo was always my best color." She gave him a sly look. "Glambo, you're such a dork." The wide grin returned to his features as he activated the turn signal for the abandoned marina at the foot of the bridge. Despite the grim tidings they bore, once they left the car pinging and cooling in the lot and had time for their eyes to adjust to the surrounding nightscape, Earl spoke, stared into the darkness rather than at his paramour. "Looks like the gang's all here," he said loudly enough that it would act as an invitation to their allies. Shadows soon approached from the deep shade of the foliage. Soon Lacy, the twins, and the 2 immense squatches were arrayed around the edges of the lot. The skunk ape huddled at the fringe of the group, just out of sight and prepared to retreat if these 2 legs turned out to be the threat he assumed all 2 legs to be. "Good evening, baby girl. Are you holding up?" After switching perspectives for some time, Earl found that he and his daughter were finally of roughly the same height. She didn't grin but gave a small nod, a human gesture. "I'm okay, Dad. Hard, but we must go forward. Oscar would have no less. Neither would I. Earl hugged her and stroked her back in a way he knew would comfort her. I'm sorry and proud all at once. Oscar was as brave as anyone I've ever known. This old man couldn't have asked for a better family. I called Tom Knox yesterday. Thought he should know. I could tell the news hit him hard. He had great respect for Oscar in any form. Lacy stepped back and eyed him. Her doggish grin radiated mingled pride and sorrow, then morphed into something mischievous. You don't look so old anymore. Still you, but not. Younger and healthier and bigger. You smell like your old self. More like a two-legs. You smell content. And a little like Val. She finally broke into a small grin at her doggish joke. You also smell a little distressed. Earl nodded. Yes, for all that has gone well. Some things have been a disaster. Several of the cryptids broke free once they arrived in the city. It was reported as gang violence, but we know what cryptid attacks look like. They'd been infected with that zombie gunk, and now they were more violent than ever. A real statement, since one is a Genusqua. We used the locations of the attacks that must have happened for the past several days to plot out the general area where they're keeping the others. Val had to keep up with the work, so I did a little reconnoiter on my own. They have a warehouse in an industrial park. We think that they've moved all creatures into it, but the cryptids may have moved out on their own. The place had clearly been damaged from the inside, and too many items in the locale had been shredded. The urgency is that the media has been stirring up the local rioter goons, wannabes, social justice hoodlums, and the gangs near the area. Something will probably kick off as soon as tonight, and we don't want that crowd to be exposed to cryptid transformations. The Genusqua stared out over the sea of buildings that rose into the near distance, to towering heights, as they formed the downtown area. It had found a perch on a low building that was under construction. It didn't care for high places, but the need to observe had driven it to higher ground. Being driven to act made it angry. It was always angry, but not as furious as it had been when it broke free of the tormentors. It had smashed them to pieces. It had even killed some of the other cryptids. It felt no twinges of consciousness about such matters. Its nature was to crush, kill, and devour, and to rampage when confronted with anything it did not like, and it rarely liked anything except destruction. The sluggish feeling that had plagued him for so long had departed shortly after he and the others had arrived at the new place of pain and hiding. The two legs had not given him or the others another dose of the hated serum for a few days. When they came to rectify their mistake, he found that a torpor in which he had been ensnared had been replaced by a new level of rage and a destructive energy that even he had not felt previously. It was the best smashing sequence in his memory, followed by the best meal he'd had in far too long. Even his fury has been transcended more than he had ever experienced. Now he sought that feeling once more. He thought that maybe eating other infected cryptids might bring back the sublime sensation he'd enjoyed during the escape and intervening days at large in the urban landscape. The Gugwe had lived up to their names, eating the faces of several of the feeble beings who had tended to their needs for so long. The Gugwe were his natural enemies and had gone their own way, fleeing his wrath. The big bat cat had battled aside anyone and anything that got in its way as it fled. He yearned to smash the Gugwe and to fight, kill, and eat the cat. The dogman and the werewolf had charged at another and would have fought to death in their heightened bloodlust, brought on by withdrawals from the zombie venom. That had triggered his own enhanced anger, and he'd waded into the fray and tore all three to pieces before they could even begin to seriously damage one another. It had been fun in a way. It had sated the first edge of his rage, and startled looks and smells that emanated from the now shredded trio had been satisfying. He had pounded his way through the warehouse district, tearing through metal doors and fences and walls. He'd knocked over a few vehicles and ripped up a few of the pathetic two-legs and four-leg creatures for snacks. They universally ran screaming, yapping, or squealing from his mighty form. At first he'd been angry that they'd all refused to offer any challenge, but he discovered that the crunching of metal and breaking of glass was very satisfying, and that there were many fun objects to pick up and fling at fleeing beings. He liked throwing objects and watching them land where he intended, especially when his target was flesh and bone and lovely warm blood. He'd enjoyed the heavy little cylinder that had taken some effort to wrest from the hard ground. When he last broke free, water sprang up in a geyser that was cold and deliciously foul. He flung the fire plug into a group of two-legs and heard the crunch of bone and saw the spray of blood that indicated violent injury and death. The screams of pain and fear provided a song for him. As he bathed in the fountain that spewed so strongly, he'd created a nest in one of the buildings that had been long abandoned. He smelled the spoor of the pair of Googway that had passed through, but had been out rampaging during their trek. They had likely detected his own stench and were afraid. They tended to like high places for nests, but the upper floors of the structure were in bad shape, so they kept going. He preferred to be on the ground. After all, what could harm him? He was the apex of all predators, and too heavy to climb trees. He found a nice, damp corner and rested for a while before he went out once more to gather food. At night, he grew disturbed and angry from all the flashing lights and the odd whooping and whining wails from the sirens. He smashed up one vehicle and kept smashing until the lights and noise ceased. The creature inside had some sort of odd covering over its torso, so he'd flung it aside in disgust. Even his fangs could not easily rend the material. He'd fared better with a big boxy vehicle that held a pair of two legs, soft and delicious once they were outside of their container. It was an enjoyable time, but now faint sounds of gathering crowds reached him, along with more of the walls and lights. He smelled a large collection of two legs, then finally spotted them. They were within a hollow in a group of smaller buildings. They feebly smashed at the windows and set a few fires. The big creature rumbled in his chest. The destruction was certainly below his standard, and the fire and stench raised his hackles. He would seek out creatures and show them the pathway to proper mayhem. Then he would eat a few. He didn't like fire, but perhaps throwing some of the creatures into the flames would be fun. Before he could initiate his move towards the milling figures, he detected the humming noise. He'd heard it several times since his escape. It was closer than ever, and now he could perhaps detect the source. He searched the skyline, not knowing what he would find, but the creature that made the noise could be. He sniffed the air that was rife with odd chemical odors, but found nothing with blood. Then he noticed the tiny light that had flashed from somewhere on a thing. It hovered in the air like a great insect. A little eye on the front stared at him unblinking. With blinding speed, the great creature flung the brick it held at the object. The aim was true, and the brick smashed the flying thing into pieces that rained to the ground. The main portion fell nearby, and the Genisqua sprang upon it immediately and pummeled the machine until it resembled a different insect, one that had been crunched against the windshield of a car and splattered into a fan of debris and inner workings, then been smeared by a windshield wiper. Anger now rising, the creature decided that it was time to seek the crowd of two legs and vent some frustrations. Dr. Z listened to the radio news with growing anger and apprehension. He knew the catalyst for the latest violence were members of his menagerie. He would strangle whoever was responsible for this outrage. He glanced in the rearview mirror. He had to get to the warehouse soon. His newfound temperament was creating a hazard for himself while he drove. He got a glimpse of his hair, no longer white and silver, but a dark mass with streaks of iron gray. He had to lower and set the back seat as far as it would go to accommodate his newfound bulk. He caught himself panting and lolling his tongue just a bit. He knew there would be side effects since he'd seized the experimental dose, yet he'd hoped desperately that the physical changes would be curtailed. He wanted only strength and vitality of transformed cryptids. He made the final turn towards his destination. He saw the damage to the rolled-up doors had been disguised with a large, heavy tarp, but not truly repaired. He knew that the keeper would have worked diligently to complete as much work as he could. A growl rose from his now deep chest and escaped through his snarling visage. I'm surrounded by fools, incompetents, and liars. Apparently, I must do everything myself. The steering wheel gave a final groan and a snap. It was still intact enough to allow him to control his way to stop. He paused for a moment and checked his appearance in the rearview mirror. Definitely more hirsute. The white is gone from my hair. What big eyes I have. What big teeth. The sidewise reference to the big bad wolf had improved his mood slightly, and he cackled. The third serum had created some creature features, but otherwise seemed only beneficial. The transmogrification had remained on course, a healing sleep followed by increasingly rapid changes in physical structure. Because he'd modified the blood agents that caused the change in a typical werewolf or dogman transformation, he'd been able to add some age reduction qualities from the experiments conducted at other labs. His thoughts were interrupted by his chief crony, the keeper, Carlos Phosphus. Ridiculous name, he reminded himself, though no worse than the title he'd selected for himself. I see you are anxious to serve. Obsequious and fawning as always. Do you have any of my creatures in captivity? Anything left? The keeper, features gray and lined with fear, gaped for a moment. He's always suspected Dr. Z's true feelings towards him, but the man had never spoken with such utter loathing and contempt for him. He could clearly detect it on the man's features and demeanor. We still have the final few that we transported, still loaded in the truck. Fine, Dr. Z snapped. You may now release them into the city. We are done with secrecy except to scrub this location and desert it entirely. How many others have survived your failures? Carlos was still attempting to regain his mental footing, but he managed to respond. Besides me, 1 human and 2 Z-Tech. Here, a few others on the barge. The cryptids did some serious damage when they left. Left? The not-so-good doctor snarled. You allowed them to escape. Now you wish to diminish your guilt by way of semantics. How many cryptids have been unleashed, counting the last load that are on standby? 16, Doctor. They killed some of their own. They don't all like each other. As you know, of course. The keeper was terrified of his boss's upgraded appearance. The man was taller and appeared to be fit and clearly younger. His hair had grown, darkened, and become bushy. His eyes bulged and his teeth definitely larger and sharper. He shuddered. Dr. Z snorted at the obvious attempt to flatter him. Yes, well, you had handled the operations as we planned. They would have been let out in a manner that would have avoided the creatures that most opposed one another having direct contact. Now it's simply a mess, and we have far fewer subjects to spread the necessary chaos. However, you are fortunate. You get one last chance to get things right. There's a riot commencing in the nearest part of downtown. We can release our monsters into the crowd of lesser monsters that's rampaging. Anyone our beasts damage, but don't kill, will likely be turned in some way or another. Then they'll turn to friends, and so on, until the city and the country are ravaged and crying out for a restoration of safety. That's when the operators will offer them the option of compliance in exchange for safety. Follow our rules and you will live. It was always the way. We needed a stimulus for major change to reform the disorder that is so attached to Western ideals of freedom. Nonsense. People have no idea what's good for them until we tell them. He stared hard at the keeper. Get it done. Get the load as close to the crowd as possible before you release the cryptids. The noise and stenches should get them excited. He smiled balefully. It doesn't matter if you are caught on camera. After the next few days, it'll be time to openly offer PSAs and public directives. Besides, online theories will contribute to the panic. So quoth this raven. My darlings, as you can hear, I am still trying to get up to full strength and lung capacity. So I didn't put too much voice acting into this. My apologies. But thank you, Bear, for all these wonderful stories. Thank you so kindly for stopping by my chateau, my darlings. It does mean so much to me. Please, if you have not subscribed, as many of you have not, please do so. Give me a like so I know what you would like to hear. And comment. I always love to read your comments. And special thanks to my Patreon and membership supporters. Ciao, darlings.